It sounds like a collapsing building, the sound that a mortar makes. It whistles, then whirs, and then it roars. And then there is the sound of destruction. My friend and I were walking back from the gym early one evening en route to the dining facility in Baghdad's international zone. About 30 meters behind us, one of those mortars landed, killing a postal worker. Pushed to the gravel by the impact of the blast, we blinked, then we rose. Our ears were ringing. There were some minor scuffs on my knees, but my friend reached to scratch his back as if he had an itch. And when he brought his hand before him, he found that it was covered in his own blood. In the medical facility that evening, the doctors removed the shrapnel, and my friend returned back to work late that same night. This week marks the 10th anniversary of 9/11. 10 years since an ordinary day marked the extraordinary events that have defined the lives of a generation. And since ordinary people rose to go on and do extraordinary things. Think back to the world that you knew before that day, that beautiful morning, before the first plane pierced concrete and steel and shattered the world that we thought we knew. What is remarkable is our response. The answer was not conquest. It was liberation. It was not to live in fear, but to promote and advance freedom. And in a region of the world in which jealous dictators and megalomaniacal despots ruled over citizens like subjects, Lady Liberty's flame had been smothered by the instruments of tyranny. Freedom is the ultimate expression of our humanity. Through some of the stories that I'd like to share with you today, from the cradle and the crossroads of civilization itself, Iraq and Afghanistan, I hope to share some observations for what the meaning of freedom is to the people of these places today. I'd like to invite you to journey with me as we explore together the connection of citizens and state, the connections of citizens to one another, and the powerful connection of citizens and the idea of freedom itself. The first observations are those of the relationships between citizen and state, of the fall of tyrannical sovereignty and the rise of popular sovereignty. The great military historian Karl von Clausewitz observed that war is an extension of politics. I would add that ultimately from war, we must return to politics. It is this system in which our politics are managed that defines the relationship between whether we are citizens or whether we are subjects of the state. And when the institutions of politics fail, when constitutions are rags with which dictators use to cleanse their societies of their opponents, or when representative bodies are instruments for strongmen to impose their will on their people rather than limit the powers of any individual person, when the contract between state and citizen is broken, is when we see the emergence of conflict. Does a society select a contract of tyranny driven by fear, or does it choose one of democracy driven by hope? Iraq in late 2006 and early 2007 existed at that very intersection, and I lived it. I never thought that there would be a time when a car bomb would sound as normal as sirens near a firehouse, or the scream of an incoming mortar as something to dust off and carry on from. I hated my cell phone. It rarely delivered any good news, and all too often broke my heart. Babylon was burning. Parliament was bombed. Violence in the city made our access to Baghdad's red zone almost untenable, and retracted life in the international zone inhospitable. Dozens of rockets were landing near us several times a day. Some came uncomfortably close. Nights were filled with the sights of terrifying volleys soaring through the sky. More and more, you could hear American helicopters coming in hard. They did that when they were carrying casualties. The faces of young soldiers were hard-eyed as they roared out of checkpoints named like Assassin's Gate into a city alit with war. Some of my staff members had letters hammered to their doors at night, promising hell on earth for working with infidels. Of those brave Iraqis, some fled for their lives. They were somewhere on the highway to Damascus, all their possessions crammed into the trunks of their cars, braving the desert west of the second largest Arabian city in the world, across dark highways and through Al-Qaeda checkpoints. Some perished, and some carried on. There was nothing in my life that had prepared me for that responsibility, to call the brothers of missing sisters or comfort the fathers of slain sons. In the spring of 2007, my security team was gearing up for a mission. A sandstorm that day was getting into everything, including under my flak jacket. An orange hue descended over the city, transforming it into Martian contours. I was to meet with an influential cleric who had been educating me on the Mahdi Army, one of the forces of the Iraqi insurrection, which today is evolving from a rogue militia into the most advanced political populist movement in the country under the radical leadership of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. It was a time in which sect warred with sect, and a violent conversation on the relationship between state and mosque unfurled right onto the streets. In the corridors of Saddam's former palace, where the U.S. Embassy had established their base of operations, there were whispers of tribal awakenings to steward local control in Sunni parts of the country and fight al-Qaeda, of a developing Kurdish social contract in the north, and of the emergence of a third way to deal with Shia insurgents in the Iraqi south. Baghdad itself was balkanizing, allowing sectarian and ethnically homogenous pockets to stabilize themselves. General Petraeus had nearly developed a new way of how to prosecute the war in the districts, which is often today understood as a surge. And President Bush banked on his general's advice to correct the course, prepared to accept unpopularity over political expediency. I encountered all types and from every ilk at various locales around Baghdad during these turbulent times, including over long and intimate cups of tea at the lobby of the Al Rashid Hotel that borders international and red zones. In one of those conversations, I sat across from a medical cleric turned parliamentarian who had survived an assassination attempt only hours before. The second vehicle in his convoy had been targeted. 3 of his bodyguards were dead, and his driver had been severely wounded. Wiping the sweat from his bald head and smoothing his beard, he smiled at me and apologized for running late. He had been part of the original Egyptian Islamic Brotherhood and a core leader of the Sunni Iraqi Islamic Party. A moment later, a courtly Shia cleric elected to parliament from the province of Babel, otherwise known as Babylon, joined us. Robed in black, inordinately elegant, he settled into his chair and began the traditional greetings in Arabic. As members of the first elected parliament in Iraq, they discussed common ground on federalism vis-a-vis the Kurds in the north and the federal government in Baghdad, education policy for the country, important oil legislation, and the policy of de-Baathification itself. These were the same issues that people had been warring with just outside the hotel. Neither of these men were part of a returning diaspora. They had both spent their whole lives in Iraq, with brief sojourns in Egypt and Iran respectively. Both had spent many years in Saddam's prisons during the 1990s. Yet here they were, taking on the tasks of their people, despite the war raging around them. From time to time, the Al-Rashid shook from a nearby blast. Dust fell from the ceiling. Lights fluttered. Some would fail to come back on. A brief pause, then back to volleying words, at times thundering at each other with the same intensity as the bombs outside the building. At this moment, and in this place, they lived at that intersection of citizen and state, heroically hammering out the issues that threatened to spill out into an all-out sectarian civil war. In this place, Clausewitz would have marveled. Ebbing and flowing from Baghdad was the notion of war and politics and the grueling costs of what freedom demands. And these two citizens were willing to put their lives on the line to connect in this place, to debate the issues that faced their country, and to hammer out the shape of a state institution that would consecrate that freedom for generations. The second observation is that between citizen to citizen. and the connections that unite people in freedom rather than divide them in fear. Tyrannical states are fundamentally about conquest, rule by the principle of divide and conquer, with groups of people divided by religion, race, creed, or gender, rather than united around principles, ideals, shared values, and common interests. The national narrative in tyrannies are about those of the relationship between a people and their dictator, rather than people and their shared aspirations. In tyrannies, government and state become the same thing, whereas in democratic states, the notion of government itself is limited by the will of the people. As a society moves beyond the ghosts of their suppressors, the relationships between citizens take on new form. In Iraq, Iraqis were realizing that the more practical dimensions of politics, building infrastructure, filling potholes, turning on the lights, did not require some sectarian ideology. There is no Sunni or Shia position on paving a road. As this political realignment was commencing in Iraq, in civilization's cradle, I began my next chapter at civilization's crossroads, Afghanistan. As the airline descended into Kabul, I peeked out the window and was greeted by the jagged, snow-capped ridges of Afghanistan's famed Hindu Kush mountain ranges. It would be revealed to me later that the character of these mountains would be as much an analogy of the spirit of the people who dwelled there, majestic, in a place without time, unmovable. Within hours of landing in Kabul, one of my American colleagues grinned at me and said, "Well, you're going to have to grow a beard." A beard? Why would I do that? Well, if you don't, some of the hardliners in the South and East will think you're an infidel, or worse, fresh meat. Fresh meat. He continued grinning at me with that lunatic grin of his. And okay, a beard it is. That's how you have this beard. Over the next 2 years, Afghanistan would steal my heart. Some memories are especially spectacular. Riding horses out to meet the tribal elders and sip tea on carpets in the hills, teaching young people to organize around ideals, donkey carts and sheep herders mingling amongst regular traffic and military convoys, counseling presidential candidates and ministers, then working alongside diplomats and aid workers and coalition forces, all seeking to try and find the right way forward before returning home to warm myself near a bukhari or a small wooden stove. At night, the hills around Kabul would light up like lanterns in the night sky. Mud and modest dwellings of people who use burners for heat and light in their homes. When traveling through them, I promise you they are one of the most romantic visions of the world. Afghanistan is at the nexus of old Persian and Hindustani diplomacy, home to some of the most vigorous traders and horsemen in the world, and the graveyard of empires and ghost wars. The country, like Iraq, is richly populated with history that humbles you as you stumble through it. Nuristani sculpture and woodwork preserves Alexander's ancient sun symbology. Kipling's sword cut through the mountains at the Khyber Pass. The caverns where the Buddhas of Bamyan once stood along the old Silk Road. The gateway to Iran at the valley of Hari River in Herat. Babur's reconstructed gardens in Kabul, and early experimentations with white marbling on western border townships that served as the architectural precursors for the Taj Mahal itself. It was a place, and in this place, where I stood in awe of the youth of the people themselves. 70% of Afghanistan is under the age of 30, and one of the most important projects I had been involved with was to mentor a national organization of young Afghans into being, to share with them the ways and means of achieving the citizenship that they had been promised by the world. Over the years, we gathered local youths in every one of the country's 34 provinces to discuss what their expectations were on jobs in the economy, representation in their democracy. They were animated, humorous, but above all, completely courageous. They congealed from their provincial organizations and delegations into a national umbrella. They began to look past village caricatures that they'd grown up with. Beyond Pashtun boys and Hazara girls, they understood that their ambition for a free Afghanistan depended more on their ability to work together as citizens in defense of the state they idealized, a state of freedom rather than a state of tyranny under the Taliban. And on 9/11 in 2009, a young man by the name of Saeed Abdullah Mubarak did something extraordinary. I had come to know him as he built this national alternative to the Taliban at the grassroots. He was 28 years old, grew up in southeast Afghanistan, an unemployed student, talented poet, a guy with a ferocious sense of integrity, and an absolutely insatiable sense of humor. Insurgents captured him and his friend as they sought to grow their local organization, tortured him for hours, and when his family failed to produce a high ransom, disposed of his remains on the village street with a small note attached to his t-shirt. It reads in Pashto, "This is one among many. They will all be hunted as this one was." His friend, beaten to within an inch of his life, sat across from me in my comfortable office in Kabul, where he recounted the horrifying story minute by minute. Mubaraz, in his last minutes on earth, told his captors a poem, loosely translated as follows, and apparently delivered with the dramatic calm of a young man who knew the one thing worth dying for and living for that. It was the days when the leaves began turning, when the kings rode tall. It was the eternity of hell when her breath could be felt from Kunar River to Bamyan's mountains. And now it is upon us, but more so, it is upon you. Your hours are near, your time is upon you. So decide, will you be in the eternity of hell, or will you stand with those of us who are free? We who cannot be blemished or vanquished or mutilated, we who in the mercy of God stand in the face of you, we who will stand forever and will only grow as you shrink into the abyss of all those who have walked your path in history. His poem became a battle cry for these young people who mourn his sacrifice, his martyrdom, and are ever more bonded together as citizens of a state deepened in their determination to win their freedom, even as we might debate the notion of walking away today. The final observation I would like to leave you with tonight is that of the relationship between citizen and idea, the great pursuit of freedom. Despite the vast dissimilarities of these places and the people who dwell in them, I was able to bear witness to emerging notions of popular sovereignty, to see it in the eyes of people who are building it for themselves, and to feel it through their sacrifices and their valor, to know firsthand the cost of what it takes and the price of what we already have, to witness courage and to be constantly humbled by what that means. Images of ink-stained fingers waving in the sky while children cling to their mothers are ones we all share. These acts of defiance during days that were to be the worst and most brutal tells us a story we can never forget. There is more to what these people were doing on those days than the idealism of it all. There is more to it than the immediate interest of defeating Al-Qaeda or ending the habits of strongman regimes. Millions of people showed up despite the promise of certain death. They would assert that they themselves were the sovereigns of their countries. The event may have only lasted a mere moment within one day, but as a singular event, it cannot be denied that millions of people, for the first time in the history of their places, were free. My inbox and phone would fill up with jubilant messages from staff in the field, invoking Allah and crying for joy. They were scared, but they went to vote. Just a little while ago, I was in New York, walking in Manhattan, past the FDNY 10 house, still standing next to Ground Zero. On the bronze bas-relief sculpture standing next to it, the images of that day are accompanied by this elegant phrase, "To those who fell and to those who carry on." It was spring in New York, bright blue skies and green trees, yellow cabs darting from one corner to the next. A gust whistled through the buildings, and I had to tighten my coat around me. In the news that morning, I read about another attack, another bomb that took even more lives. The giant holes in the ground where the towers once stood is now the site of reconstruction. It dawned upon me at that moment that this is indeed the forever war, that this eternal struggle for freedom will carry on. For all the work and for all the sacrifices made by so many, the job remains unfinished. The world we know now, 10 years later, stands at the intersection of idealism and realism, of balancing what we aspire to do with what we have to do. And the hard years of ending the mythical leadership of madmen commenced with the fall of Saddam Hussein, and liberty's flames are now spreading like wildfire, connecting citizens to an idea, an irrepressible, irreducible, irreplaceable idea centered upon the dignity of men and women. It is a choice we make in every moment to be free or to live in servitude. Servitude to a tyrant or servitude to our own expectations of ourselves. I landed in Baghdad a few days after September 11th in 2006. In the seat next to me was a remarkable young woman. She was a fierce American Democrat who did not support the Iraq War. She came from the halls of Al Franken's liberal radio show, Air America, and took the risks she thought she could to help the Iraqi parliament and political leaders establish their ability to communicate the people's business to the people of Iraq. In the line of her work, Al-Qaeda in Iraq discovered one of their many targets. And in Mansour district of Baghdad city, Andy Parhamovich died in a hail of gunfire. When the insurgents failed to open the doors to her armored vehicle to kidnap her, they tossed grenades under the car and let her and her security people die in the flames that engulfed the vehicle. If my friend were to be here today, she would share with you what she has shared with me, and that is the idea of freedom itself is an idea that we as free citizens must cling closely to, and a burden we must shoulder proudly. And if that she could cast off her inhibitions in service of this great idea, then so too can you, and so too can I. Across the broader Middle East, we now watch as a generation casts off their own inhibitions and choose to stand as free citizens. We lucky few who linger on can now make the great decision to pursue this great idea, to live not in fear, but in freedom. Thank you.